Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Building the Pipeline, Exploring Anchors in Resilient Communities. My name is Andrew Carberry with the Wallace Center. We're co-presenting today with Kitchen Sink Strategies, Healthcare Without Harm, and the Emerald Cities Collaborative. Some quick Zoom tech. If you could turn your video on, we'll have some Q&A later on and some open portions. We'd love to see you. You'll come in as muted in the lower left hand. You can mute and unmute yourself. You can also join with computer audio. In the upper right, you can click the three dots next to your name. You can rename yourself as you'd like that to present. And we'll be using the chat box today for questions and comments. You can share those to everyone in the chat. You can also directly message myself or Elliot Baumstein if you have any technical questions or issues with Zoom. Today's webinar is presented by the Food Systems Leadership Network, which is a national peer learning community that connects current and emerging leaders, strengthens individual and collective leadership capacity, fosters collaboration across communities, all to the goal of accelerating the realization of a just, equitable, and sustainable food system that generates good food, health, and opportunity for all. And today's webinar is the first in a series that we'll be presenting over this fall. Today's call will be about 75 minutes. We'll have some intro and framing to the series to begin with. Then we'll have a panel presentation from Healthcare Without Harm and the Emerald Cities Collaborative, and then time for Q&A as mentioned. So you can fill those in the chat box as they come in throughout the time. In the Wallace Center's work supporting value chain enterprises and community-based nonprofit organizations, anchor institutions often come up as a potential partner because they have a unique ability and often the responsibility to support equitable, local, and sustainable supply chains. This has come up in value chain coordination work, in a food hub community of practice, and in others. In this series, we'll explore creative strategies for leveraging institutional investments in support of the local food supply chain. And our guiding question in developing this series has been, how can institutions invest in the hard and soft infrastructure that we all acknowledge is critical to realize the goals of equitable, local, and sustainable institutional purchasing? We are learning about this practice ourselves and lifting up promising examples and experiments as we find out about them. Our goal is to allow community leaders to explain their strategy and share their stories of the work institutions who have made these types of investments to improve access to institutional market channels for local and regional food and farm businesses with an emphasis on Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned food businesses. These stories will not focus on increasing demand or setting procurement goals at institutions, rather building the community infrastructure to meet those procurement goals. Many hospitals, universities, and other institutions have made purchasing commitments to align with their values around supporting the local economy, small businesses, and communities of color. We will look at ways communities can partner with institutions to build on that momentum. We acknowledge the immense amount of work that has gone and continues to go into these projects, and we're thankful for those who have led the way in this work, including the Center for Good Food Purchasing, Healthcare Without Harm, Farm to Institution New England, and many others who I see here on the call today. This series is part of a larger project that Wallace is developing that will include an accelerator program for organizations involved in this work, and we'll share more about that later on in this series. Again, thank you all for coming. It's so great to see you all here for this conversation. Invite you to turn your videos on if you'd like for this initial part, share comments or things in the chat. And now I'd like to turn it over to Elliot Smith, who will dig more into details about the research that we've been doing around this practice. As a former Wallace Center Fellow with experience shifting institutional procurement programs and implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program in Central Texas, Elliot is a co-founder of systems change company Kitchen Sink Strategies. He brings public, philanthropic, and private sector experience to the work of building regional food economies that nourish the people and the planet. We've been really excited to partner with him and bring this research to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate the intro and welcome everybody. It's so exciting to see so many folks from all over, it looks like, and that to see so many folks excited and interested in this topic is really encouraging for us on this project. I'm going to start here by sort of setting some context and providing some detail around the spirit that's informing this project of the Wallace Center, identify some themes that might surface in this talk, and then also unpack some important terms for the work that we're sort of putting forth here. As Andrew said, for years, all of you on this call, I anticipate, know that efforts across the US have been trying to crack this net of institutional food purchasing. And the so-called anchor promise, wherein an institution it's based in a place leverages its assets and purchasing power for community development, still remains this elusive target. When it's successful, often it's because there's a really committed individual within an institution who wants to push the work forward, or perhaps a specific kind of one-off arrangement that's made a purchase possible. In entering into this discussion, we really wanted to understand more about what makes the work stick and succeed in the long term. And so we reached out to lots of folks. As part of my research here with the Wallace Center, we've called leaders from really all over, most of, if not all of the regions of the US. We've talked with practitioners who have really specialized experience in some aspect of the food economy. And then we've connected with systems thinkers throughout the food space to ask, hey, how are the institutions in your areas investing in that infrastructure that Andrew noted? If we realize that if we recognize that it's critical for the local commitments, the sustainable commitments, the equitable purchasing commitments that so much work is focused on. And the hypothesis there is that by making investments in that infrastructure and developing the pipeline of food businesses whose values reflect those of the institutions can not only meet the purchasing goals, they can also improve the broadly speaking, resilience of their regional food economy. Especially, and as Andrew noted, we're especially interested when they're doing this and partner with and invest in businesses owned by people of color throughout the food economy. So we've kind of zoomed out a little bit on the discussion of institutional market channels. And we're setting a little bit of a broader aperture on this topic by thinking through what we are calling institutional investment in the equitable food economy. And it's important to unpack both of those terms, I think. It's the words institution and investment mean a lot. And just to spend a minute or two talking about those, when in this project we say institution, what we're considering are hospital systems, universities, and local governments. And the logic there is that these are often institutions that already have some sort of a mandate or a charter to do community development work, in addition to being large purchasers of food in their economy. Thinking, for example, nonprofit hospitals in the US participate in the community benefits program established in the Affordable Care Act. Land grant universities have a very particular charter to develop the agricultural industry in their regions. We are not saying institutions thinking about public K-12 food systems. And the reason we've drawn this distinction is because public K-12 systems are particularly complicated. They have serious challenges and frankly, a lot of red tape that these other institutions don't, like national school lunch program requirements and wildly variable and particularly complicated funding streams. And we felt that this was such a unique challenge that really addressing the farm to school market channel demands its own focus. So when we say institutions, we're not considering K-12 public school systems. So institutional investment. The second half of that phrase is also another kind of a buzzword, because I think investment is a term that a lot of us food systems practitioners aren't particularly comfortable with. And it can mean many different things and connotes many different things. So as we entered into this project, we really acknowledged the work of a lot of the wise folks, many of you on this call, who have been studying the details of this market channel. And in addition, our own experience working on this over the past few years as a group, we really understand that the core challenge that faces a lot of this work is, in essence, the challenge of building genuine relationships. For projects to succeed and last in breaking with the status quo, they have to foster and sustain a whole network of relationships within the institutions, with community leaders beyond the institutions. And so when we're thinking about investment, we acknowledge that the relational component of these partnerships, these investments made with time and money, is critical. At the same time, we understand that ultimately shifting the ways that money moves through this ecosystem, as in leveraging financial investments or facilitating financial transactions between buyers and suppliers, is absolutely necessary for us to change the structures that determine how this whole thing works and determine, frankly, what we eat. And this transactional approach is just as important. Oftentimes, in all sorts of analyses here, there's a dichotomy that gets drawn between relational approaches and transactional approaches that puts them at odds with each other. And so in being careful to approach this work as holistically as possible, we've taken this idea that neither is intrinsically good or bad, and rather we're seeking to be able to understand and use each of these approaches to drive towards this transformative systems change that we're all kind of circling around. So just to put an example out, and a type of investment that we've encountered in the research and calls we've made are, for example, a university system that has developed the cold chain storage capacity of its region by purchasing a walk-in cooler and inviting its network of regional farmers to leverage this new infrastructural asset so that they can make the purchases of local. These kinds of ideas. We're taking and thinking about investment a little bit more of an expansive term, an expansive view of the term that recognizes, again, both the importance of a relational approach and the transactional approach. So that's a lot of layout to have before we get to this wonderful conversation. But I want to shift our attention now to what we're all here and excited to hear from the folks that Andrew mentioned about. We're going to hear a fantastic example about this Anchors in Resilient Communities project based in the East Bay. And before I turn it over to Lucia to introduce the great panel, I want to just flag everybody to think about this relational and transactional dichotomy or the nature of both of those approaches, and listen to how wonderful the story about them co-evolving, this relational component and this transactional component, developing over time, and how that's been a real asset for this project. So yes, I'll turn it over to Lucia there now. Lucia is the Director of Regional Innovation and Community Resilience for the Healthy Food and Healthcare Program of Healthcare Without Harm, and she'll introduce the other speakers, and we'll get this party started. So Lucia.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great, okay. Thanks, Elliot, and thanks to the folks at Wallace Center for the invitation to present about institutional investment in the ARC project and the development of the new East Bay Sustainable Food Production Center. We are really excited for this opportunity today. So we have 4 presentations for today's webinar that hopefully will shed more light on the variety of activities and partners, the complexity of this work. So first we're going to hear from Jean Noodleman, who is the Senior Director of Community Health with Kaiser Permanente, about Kaiser's investment in ARC and community health and wealth building. Unfortunately, Jean had to attend to a family medical issue today, but was kind enough to pre-record her talk and is happy to answer any follow-up questions people might have after the webinar. I'll then provide some background on ARC, how it got started, who's involved, and the components that make up our regional food system strategy in ARC. Then I'll pass it to Elise Rainey, who is the Economic Inclusion Manager with Emerald Cities Collaborative, to present about the regional food system work, and in particular, a pilot procurement project we began this year in preparation for the opening of the new center. Then Elise will pass it to Kevin Werner, who is the Managing Director of Be Modern Sustainability Ventures, who is leading the development team for the new center. And Kevin's going to provide some details around the financing, construction, and community commitments of the new center. And I'm going to stop there. Wallace Center is going to provide the full bios of all the speakers in the notes, and that'll be sent out after the webinar. So to get us started, I'm going to pass it back to Elliot and Andrew to get us started with Jean's presentation.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I am queuing this up.
Hello, I'm Jean Noodleman, Senior Director of Community Health for Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. I'm delighted to participate in this webinar, and I thank you for allowing me to pre-record my portion. I'd like to share a bit about Kaiser Permanente. We are the nation's largest integrated nonprofit health system, serving over 12.4 million members across 9 regions in the United States. And our mission is to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities that we serve. I'd like to share a bit about our approach to community health, which is one way in which we embody our mission. We believe that health begins with our communities, in our communities, and that where people live, work, learn, and play is more influential on their health than access to healthcare services alone. And we have developed strategies to address important health needs by marshaling the assets of our organization and by partnering with others. We have a series of different strategies, all of which I find very exciting, but would like in particular to talk to you today about Kaiser Permanente as an anchor institution, our approach to supporting economic opportunity, and our approach to environmental security. Anchor institutions, which you may or may not have heard the term, but that's what we're here to talk about today, can be thought of as organizations that have social missions, nonprofit or public institutions, and are rooted in place. They're not leaving. So local government, hospitals and health systems, community-based, place-based foundations and universities. And they have economic engines as large purchasers, employers, and investors. Kaiser Permanente is a health anchor. And we believe that by leveraging our business practices, in particular for local hiring, for sourcing local and diverse, and investing in our places, we can tackle the underlying causes of poor health. Kaiser Permanente is not alone as a health anchor. We actually belong to the Health Anchor Network, which includes over 50 health systems with more than 700 hospitals across the United States. You can see there's a tremendous impact that these members have together, employing over 1.5 million people, with purchasing of over $50 billion and with $150 billion in investment assets. Here's a snapshot of some of the members of the Health Anchor Network. We are delighted to work together, to learn together, and to continue to advance the field. So Kaiser Permanente, as part of who we are to achieve our mission, has a deep commitment to economic opportunity. We know that improving the economic opportunity in our communities leads to healthier and more equitable communities. And I'd like to share a bit about what our strategy is. Again, drawing on our role as a health anchor, we focus on 3 areas. We leverage the resources within our business operations, such as human resources, with a focus on high impact hiring and building an inclusive workforce pipeline, on procurement, with a focus on diverse purchasing and local impact purchasing, in supporting the local business capacity to support businesses to be able to be part of large institutions' supply chain, and working with our own treasury to have strategic impact investments. We're excited to have community health partnerships in 4 programmatic areas, which really we think work together to address structural barriers to equitable economic mobility, in such areas as supporting this business growth of small and diverse businesses with a particular focus on those who are led by people of color, focusing on strengthening individual and families' financial strength, creating career pipelines for quality jobs and careers, and supporting young people to be successful in school and to be prepared for college and career. And last, again, engaging with our peers that we think is critically important in such areas as the Healthcare Anchor Network, and engaging strategically with customers and as well with vendors. I'd like to switch now and talk a bit about Kaiser Permanente's commitment to environmental stewardship. In 2016, we made bold commitments to achieve the stewardship of important environmental assets. And I'm very delighted to say that we announced this year that we were the first health system in the nation who has achieved a carbon neutral status, which we had originally projected to achieve by 2025. You can also see that our goals include a focus on water conservation, on waste reduction, on working to ensure that the products that we purchase are safer, meeting environmental sustainability standards, and collaborating with others. The element that I'd like to talk about specifically is our commitment to purchasing sustainable food. And our commitment is that 100% of the food that we purchase to be served to our facilities is sustainable. And it's produced in what we consider to be a local service area, which is approximately 250 miles. We are very delighted to be able to work in Northern California with a longtime supplier and vendor, Food Service Partners, who is working very closely with us to be able to achieve this bold and transformational goal of sustainable food. And this brings us to ARC. So Kaiser Permanente has been an active participant in ARC since its inception. We've actively participated in the steering committee and evaluation work groups, and we've been able to provide charitable contributions to support the work of ARC. We've supported ARC's, the work that they've done as a coalition and as a backbone institution to bring together a diverse group of different partners, and you'll hear more about that. And I'm very excited that we were able to be instrumental through a grant that was provided through our donor advised fund to a local community development financial institution that was really instrumental by providing credit enhancement to be able to be instrumental in the acquisition and the construction of a food production facility in southern Alameda County. And our colleague Kevin Warner will be sharing much more about this exciting transaction and all the plans that we have for opening and being able to use this as a site for food production for food service partners. So we're really delighted to be an instrumental partner with ARC and to be able to bring all of our assets as an anchor institution to this important work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. The wonders of technology. Shall I go ahead and just start? I'm going to provide a bit more background about the ARC model and how the project came to be. First slide, Andrew.
All right, are you seeing the slide?
Yep, thanks.
Cool.
So ARC basically got its start about 6 years ago through conversations between Denise Fairchild of Emerald Cities Collaborative and Gary Cohen of Healthcare Without Harm, asking the question, what if we could bring together community stakeholders and anchor institutions to foster a long-term relationship, working together to strategize how anchors can best use their procurement practices and investments to build community health, wealth, and climate resilience. It was a really strong partnership from the start, with ECC, Emerald Cities Collaborative, having built over more than a decade of deep roots, programs, and relationship in the communities of the East Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Healthcare Without Harm having built a strong network among healthcare institutions in those same communities, working to improve the environmental health within the sector and beginning to help define their role as anchor institutions to address the social determinants of health. So in partnership with Kaiser, the California Endowment, and other stakeholders, ECC and Healthcare Without Harm began to convene a conversation at this table called ARC. One of the first activities of the table was to work with the Democracy Collaborative, who many of you are probably familiar with, to conduct an assessment of basically two things: to gather information about what anchor institutions of the East Bay collectively procure or purchase in terms of goods and services. What's the need? What's the demand out there? And second is was to look at the capacity and potential of communities in the East Bay that could be supported and ramped up to meet some of that institutional demand. The assessment involved over 200 interviews of anchor reps and community stakeholders and took about 15 months to complete. And two major findings from the assessment were, one, that East Bay anchor institutions, and this is not including San Francisco, this is across the pond basically, East Bay anchor institutions collectively spend about $6.8 billion a year on goods and services. And number two, that there were many opportunities for East Bay communities to meet some of that institutional demand, particularly in the areas of green energy, green building and construction, and a vibrant local food system. Next slide. Thanks. So while we're presenting today on ARC's Regional Food System Initiative, just want to underscore that the ARC table is not just about food. The ARC table hopefully represents a new model of partnership in community and relationship building between anchor institutions and community to address many issues that factor into what it means to be a resilient community. So we are looking at locally available renewable resources like food, water, and energy, diverse, simple systems for electricity, water, and transportation, foresight into future conditions and plans of action, and of course, social equity. So this work on the Regional Food System Initiative is our first project. It's the first project of ARC. Also, just want to point out, it's not just healthcare anchors with community at the ARC table, but also municipalities are represented, public agencies, universities. Just to give you an idea, some of the ARC participants include the East Oakland Building Healthy Communities Project of the California Endowment, Roots Community Health Center, City of Oakland, San Mateo County Health, Self-Help Credit Union, Project Equity, Rubicon programs, and then other anchors like UCSF, health anchors like UCSF and Common Spirit. So, and those are just a few of the folks that are at the table and engaged in this work. So next slide. So ARC's focus on the regional food system as a first project also happened in an interesting way. As the group was reviewing the Democracy Collaborative's assessment and talking over next steps, Jan Villarante, the Nutrition and Food Services Director at Kaiser, was having conversations with their vendor, Food Service Partners, about a renewal for Kaiser's Northern California patient meals contract. And FSP was communicating their need to expand their operations from their current facility, which is in South San Francisco, to help meet Kaiser's goal of 100% local and sustainable food sourcing by 2025. So it was Jan's idea, knowing about the work of ARC and having participated in the conversations around ARC, it was her idea to invite Food Service Partners to the table for a conversation about potential expansion of their operations in the East Bay. So we realized pretty quickly during those initial conversations that the commitment of the ARC table to community health and wealth building was very aligned with Food Service Partners' goals as a food service provider and company. Those conversations were the beginning of a partnership that has brought us to where we are today with the opening of the new East Bay Sustainable Food Production Center scheduled for December 2020. And Kevin's going to present about how the financing development for the new center has all come together in a few minutes. The new center figures prominently in ARC's regional food system strategy, which intends to aggregate institutional demand for local and sustainable food products, increase community-owned food business and manufacturing opportunities, and to increase opportunities for local Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, producers and processors who have been historically excluded from institutional markets. So ARC's role is really focused on building the value chain in community around the center. And the vision, it is that all of these different components that you see on the bottom of the slide, production, processing, distribution, waste management, all happens here in our regional food economy and is community owned and community driven. Next slide. So what is ARC's role in supporting the success of this new food production center? We're not builders, we're not financiers, we're not doing the construction. ARC's role in supporting the success of the center really falls into two major categories: the increase of local and sustainable sourcing and workforce and career pathways for underserved communities. So we are acting as a facilitator between food service partners and regional food system community partners that Elise is going to talk about in just a minute. We are piloting forward contracting and other institutional strategies, trying things out to create these more seamless pipelines, increase the number of BIPOC food producers and community-owned food businesses with institutional contracts, supporting capacity building efforts for access into the institutional markets like cold dry storage, food processing capacity, the things that we have heard about from our community partners. And lastly, to increase the volume of institutional contracts for the new food production center. And that really gets to the first part of our strategy around aggregating volume demand among institutions. Next slide. And lastly, ARC's role in supporting the success of the new center in the area of workforce and career pathways development. Again, ARC's role is acting as kind of a facilitator between our community workforce partners and food service partners staff. We're working to support hiring for and retention of living wage union jobs at the new center, prioritizing local justice-involved, formerly long-term unemployed people of color. And lastly, building pathways to long-term community ownership of food-related businesses around the center and of the center itself in a number of years, 5 to 7 years. Kevin, again, will talk a little bit more about that in his presentation. So I think I will stop there, and Elise, I will pass the ball to you to dive into the regional food systems work.
Awesome, thanks, Lucia. So Lucia gave us some good background on the history of ARC as well as some of the breadth and depth of ARC, but I want to take a deeper dive in terms of our work with our East Bay Regional Food System. So pretty much like all of ARC's work, it is a collaborative initiative with our Regional Food System Initiative. It's currently our major players are with Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente's inpatient meal provider, that's food service partners, community members, as well as stakeholders from our East Bay Regional Food System. And right now in our current iteration of our pilot, our focus right now is increasing contracting opportunities for hyperlocal farmers. That means increasing food service partners sourcing from farmers within 50 miles of their processing facility, as well as increasing contracting opportunities for farmers and food entrepreneurs of color. And so before we kind of start this conversation, I think it's important, and I think even Elliot talked about this at the beginning of the webinar, was about the importance of equity. And I think that's actually one of the strengths of ARC's table and ARC's work. And so one of the practices that I wanted to call out is how in our regional food system work, as well as with ARC just in general, we really like to center equity as opposed to address equity. And I wanted to just take a minute to really identify what that looks like in our food system work. So if we could go to the next slide. Awesome. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of, and Lucia actually talked about this in terms of food being the kind of the first arena to take off, but that was really a reflection of the community's desires as well as the anchors, desires and needs, as well as already stated strategy, as well as kind of an opportunity that came up to the surface in terms of FSP's recontracting, right? The other way that we center equity is that we create solutions that account for inequity or exclusion, right? And this is perhaps as opposed to diverse recruitment where you hire or pull in folks that basically have to rise above obstacles that may exclude them typically. There's also opportunities for increasing access to capital, information, and opportunity. We very much bring our partners into pretty much all of our conversations. We kind of very much have an open door policy. And some of our smaller wins have been some of the successes that have come out just from increasing relationship and increasing access to different folks and to different players. And then also, of course, transformative systems change. We want to make sure that any solutions that we come up with through this food pilot is something that is actually creating more equity, right? As opposed to creating one-off successes for a few folks, right? And we can go through the next slide. The one thing that I do want to also call out is I don't want to throw addressing equity under the bus because I do feel like sometimes it could be a good place for people to start. And I also realize in this work, frequently internal champions can make or break any project, right? And internal champions frequently have varying levels of power and influence and budget, right? The other thing I want to know is that sometimes when you address equity, and when I say address equity, what I'm implying is that equity is a secondary or a subsequent goal to your, say, your sustainability goals, right? It can be faster, right? And sometimes there's a sense of urgency in terms of how things are done, right? The one thing that I did want to point out is that, it can be faster. You can get some wins in terms of diverse recruitment. You do kind of run the risk on some levels in terms of tokenizing folks. But the one thing to watch out for in terms of some of the transformative systems change that you can create, because you can actually create transformative systems change while addressing equity. But we've kind of had to learn this lesson the hard way with the slow food movement, with solar and alternative energy, is that you run the risk of creating transformative system change largely for white folks, right? And so if we can go through the next slide. With our pilot, which I discussed a little bit earlier in terms of helping food service partners source from East Bay regional food stakeholders. We currently are working with two of our main partners, which is Dig Deep Farms as well as Mandela Partners. And that choice was very intentional. One, because they are very equity focused as well as committed to the East Bay community. But we also were working with their food hubs or their food distribution arms of their organizations, right? And because we also know that they have a commitment to farmers of color and food entrepreneurs of color. And so our pilot is basically to have that first cycle, have that first round, and have them actually source for food service partners. And the reason why we did the pilot, which me and Lucia have actually kind of had this back and forth, is this curiosity, is that one, it is very complex to untangle some of these systems that disenfranchise low-income communities and communities of color. There's just so many levels and so many barriers to entry that on a certain level, we kind of got stuck a little bit. It was kind of a little too overwhelming to take on or to think our way out of while sitting at a table. And so what we decided was that we were going to actually do a pilot, try and get our hands dirty, see what we could learn, and then try and improve from there. And so at this point, just to kind of acknowledge some of the kind of procurement pressure points we've identified while really centering equity, I just wanted to call those out a little bit. And so as you can kind of see, and this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, that sustainable and local procurement frequently cannot compete with conventional price points. If you have questions about that, we can answer that. But I think it's pretty self-explanatory, right? A lot of these conventional price points are based off of the fact that they're not paying laborers living wage jobs, right? And so when you have two organizations like Mandela and Dig Deep who are really committed to that, it is very hard. I will say that on some level they have to compete regardless, right? But these profit margins are so tight, right? And then kind of as I mentioned before, the price points that don't account for living wages, right? And I think we can frequently find that, especially as it relates to sustainability goals in anchor work, is that sometimes we divorce sustainability, well, environmental sustainability from human sustainability in terms of like people being able to provide for their families. And inevitably, these two forces feed off of one another, right? It's not something that you can't do, that you can, well, I feel like, I'll say this, I have a hard time imagining it's something that you can actually divorce. So next slide for me, please. Awesome. Another kind of pressure point, or I don't know, it's not necessarily obstacle, but it's varying levels of capacity and desire to take on risk and varying skill level on doing equity work. I think, and again, I think Elliot kind of pointed this out. He gave away all the good tidbits, but relationship is so important, right? Because you kind of come up against these like little, little hiccups. And part of it is honestly, this doing anchor work by definition is a new way of doing work for many of our partners, for ourselves, right? Especially for for-profit businesses, right? And kind of really calling out why you're building systems that work for farmers of color, right? Sometimes it needs a little more explanation and a little more greasing of the wheels to actually get it to follow through, right? Because quite honestly, we're asking them to change their systems, right? Systems that have worked for years, right? And that they're very accustomed and comfortable with and have been successful with. And then kind of, as I mentioned before, is like the complex systems to navigate or overcome. And so if I could click to the next slide. If there is one call to action or encouragement I can give to folks who are interested in this work, is to actually start small and start today. I feel like if there was one thing I could do in terms of going back in time and saving myself and perhaps our partners some headache and heartache, it would be to just get started, right? I think we wanted to come out with like a really great strategy, but what kind of happens is that, kind of every month, every couple of weeks, a new little hiccup or a new issue that needs creative problem solving comes up. And it's actually much more effective to just kind of like chip away at it. From my standpoint, I'd actually be really curious, and I'd love to hear it in the chat, if folks know of communities where perhaps there was already enough relationship, already enough trust, already some successes that they could build off where a pilot was not necessary. But I want to encourage folks to change their approach to this work in terms of starting small. And so when I say that, I mean to create a smaller container to mitigate risk, right? And kind of learn while doing. So go in with it with the idea that it's not going to be perfect, that you are going to have multiple iterations, right? And that the idea is that you as a group collectively will be making things better and perfect as you go along, right? Again, as I mentioned before, tackle issues that come along as opposed to trying to untangle complex systems, right? And as anybody who's done supply chain logistics, it's complex already. Then you add added complexities in terms of like food safety compliance, insurance issues, distribution, delivery, receiving, right? Price points, that's a whole nother conversation, right? I don't know, maybe there's some like NASA astronauts that could figure out that level of complexity, but I would say just try and chip away, just try and create a process and try and like, you know, move through it slowly and surely. Another thing I really want to call out in terms of starting small and starting today is that I also hope that it kind of changes the power dynamic sometimes between anchors and community groups, or anchor vendors and potential new vendors, particularly vendors of, that are owned and operated by people of color. Sometimes when you have more power and privilege, you can push the solution or push the problem solving onto folks who have less power and privilege than you. To rephrase that, basically, you know, anchor vendors could tell, you know, basically farmers of color, you guys figure out how you work within our system, right? And we actually want to move away from that kind of dynamic. And we want for our anchors and our anchor vendors and community members to be co-conspirators in finding solutions, right? So we're not saying that it's the disenfranchised community's responsibility to figure out how to overcome the systems that are disenfranchising them, right? And so I feel like the next slide would be great here. Trying to make sure I'm moving through, doing good time. Okay. And so as I mentioned, it's the pilot with Mandela Partners and Dig Deep Farms. I do want to spend a little time talking just a smidge about them. Mandela Partners has a long history in terms of food justice in the East Bay. They were one of the first like reliable good food sources for fruits and veggies in West Oakland, which is kind of a textbook example of a food desert. They've actually split from that co-op right now. They have Mandela Grocery Co-op, and then they have Mandela Partners, which is largely a distributor. And they have a number of liquor and corner stores that they source, as well as health institutions that they source for fresh veggies and fruits for communities that struggle with having access to healthy food. And then they also very much have a commitment to sourcing from farmers of color, as well as food entrepreneurs of color. Dig Deep Farms, similarly, they also are very much connected and deep in the food as medicine movement, and provide a lot of fruits and veggies to high risk or patients with diet-related diseases or low-income patients as well. And they also have a connection because they're through the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. They are also addressing crime in a preventive way by providing living wage jobs, right? And living wage green jobs. And so again, we have two strong equity-focused partners. And the beauty of this, well, I guess it's the beauty of always working within collaboration, is that I don't have to have all the answers, or Lucia doesn't have to have all the answers, right? Because our partners are co-creating this pilot with us. And they bring it. They totally bring it. I don't know if you guys have ever had any interactions with Mandela and Dig Deep Farms, but their experience and their brilliance and their know-how is just invaluable to this work. Yeah. So it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to, sometimes sit on the sidelines and see the magic, right? Just witness it. And so the hope after we kind of cross this threshold of this pilot, have a little more time under our belt, kind of let it roll out for a little bit, is to come back to the table and kind of identify future strategies for building the pipeline based off of this deeper understanding. Part of the intention of this pilot is to not only learn by doing, but it's also to kind of help remove some of all these unknown variables that were dynamic and changing at any given time, right? And so just to give some examples, well, I won't go too deep into it, but after we've kind of had some lived experience in terms of what does it actually mean to have an East Bay POs, person of color run organizations that are sourcing from farmers of color, actually source Kaiser's vendors, we can then actually go back to the table and see, how do we actually make this sustainable? How do we amplify this work? How do we actually make this make more economic sense? How do we build economic wealth with this initiative, right? And we'll be better able to identify what the pressure points are, what the real pressure points are, or what the most important pressure points are, where the opportunities lie, and what levers are at our disposal. And I think the hope is for us to actually take that back, one, to the anchors as well as the anchor vendors, or perhaps to other funders, or to recruit more capital or support or infrastructure for our food system, right? And come with a really targeted ask, right? That we know will work because we've been testing everything out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the last slide for me. I'm gonna click the last one, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, that's the last slide for me. So I'm gonna pass it back to Lucia so she can introduce our last speaker.
Kevin, are you on the line?
I am Lucia.
There you are. Hi, Kevin. Well, I've already introduced you, so I will just pass the ball to you to talk about the exciting developments going on in Union City around the new food production center.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join the webinar today. I'm very excited to give you a summary overview of a project that is actually nearing completion in the East Bay, Union City, which is in southern central Alameda County, right along the 880 corridor. But I wanted to start off actually by framing a little experience I've had today. I think this is my, the many things that I do, this was definitely my healthy food day. I started off earlier on a Washington Post live Rockefeller Foundation sponsored interview on healthy food systems. And it included Mike Johans and Tom Vilsack, both former secretaries of agriculture. And it was very interesting. Amongst the many things they spoke about, one of the things that both of them mentioned in a number of ideas that they spoke about is the need for infrastructure to help grow a prosperous local healthy food system. They both agreed that the infrastructure was severely lacking for local food systems. And to give you an example, I'm sure many of you have heard these factoids, but Secretary Johans mentioned that even today, 90% of the beef consumed in the United States and produced in the United States runs through fewer than 10 locations, 10 plants, processing 90% of the beef in the United States. Secretary Vilsack then followed up by mentioning that one of the challenges that he has found both as a governor in Iowa and as the Secretary of Agriculture was the lack of kind of locally place-based cold storage and processing facilities. And so that got me thinking a lot about what I was going to say today. I'm going to try to build on some of the ideas and the comments that you've heard from the previous speakers, and in the process introduce myself and how I got to be in this place, leading the development team of the East Bay Regional Sustainable Food Center, which is actually named Faber Street Foodworks because it lives on Faber Street in Union City, California. But let me give you a little bit of history on how this project came to be. I actually met Food Service Partners when I was on staff with Emerald Cities Collaborative. And they had launched an initiative with Kaiser and with ARC to locate and develop another facility in a different community in Richmond, California, which is also East Bay. And had gone fairly far along the pathway of trying to come up with preliminary designs and programming for it. And the long story short is it wasn't the right size and it wasn't the right financing. And so that leads me to the project I want to talk to you about today, which is Faber Street Foodworks. I spent a lot of time with the executives and actually the Northern California staff, including the general manager at Food Service Partners, to find out what their actual needs were. Spent a lot of time with the ARC team and a lot of time with Kaiser Permanente, trying to understand what their desires were for this project. and quickly came to a realization that one of the problems that food service partners had in fulfilling their commitment to sourcing 100% local and sustainable food for Kaiser Permanente and other clients of theirs is their facility was too small. Quite literally, they did not have enough cold storage in their current facility to purchase at a scale, to purchase local product at a scale that would allow them to be profitable. And that's a problem that I think Secretary Vilsack was referring to today in the Washington Post event, is that these big companies out there, you know, big mega agricultural companies, they have lots of capital, they have lots of access to partners. They're able to build massive facilities and massive supply chains. And so, you know, they can take on these big projects. But a company like Food Service Partners, let alone a very small local or regional operator, Food Service Partners is actually a national company that's been in existence for 21 years and has been profitable from day one. This year, they're going to probably do close to $30 million of gross sales nationally. But even a company like that has a lot of difficulty attracting capital. Their project is fairly small. It's too small for commercial lenders, and it's too big for community lenders. So how do we put together a project that meets all of the objectives, that delivers the critical infrastructure that a company like Food Service Partners needs to not only deliver on its commitments for local, sustainable, and equitably produced foods, but also to allow them to grow and to prosper even more? How do we make that happen, knowing that traditional capital for projects like this is really unattainable because our project is too small or too large? And that took some doing, and it took some wrangling. And that's actually the reason why I left Emerald Cities Collaborative, because I felt like this project was really critical to grow the food system that we were all looking to make happen in the Bay Area. And that's really point number one, which I want to leave you with, is to get these kind of infrastructure projects completed, it takes a team of people, but it takes the commitment of people to get it done. And, you know, if you don't have an organization built around delivering and financing and project managing a project like this, it's very difficult to get it done. It's very difficult to make it happen. So it really requires the organization of the community and the stakeholders around the very specific needs of a physical asset like a 56,000 square foot food production facility. For those of you who have ever worked in one or have ever been part of the construction of one or the development of one, you know that it's a very technical build, meaning there's a lot of mechanical parts to it. It's not just putting up framing and a roof and some basic electrical and plumbing. The health codes, the building codes, regarding health, public health is very specific around, drainage and handling of grease and all sorts of things that come out of the food production activities that go inside of a building like this. At the same time, we wanted to build the most environmentally sensitive, lowest environmental footprint facility we could. And that meant that we wanted to locate in an existing community. We didn't want to build out in, a green field somewhere. We wanted to put it close to the communities that we wanted to serve, both in terms of food production and employment and opportunities, and also to the suppliers in the local supply chain. Because if we can lessen the distance that food has to travel, we're definitely making a dent in the local sustainable food system. So when we add all these layers, what it does is it adds a lot of complexity and actually narrows the field of possibilities, particularly in a market like the San Francisco Bay Area, which I think, as everybody knows, notwithstanding the current economic crisis we are currently facing, is an extremely costly real estate market. We're trying to build a very particular building with a lot of social and environmental benefits attached to it, in a marketplace where, you know, owners and sellers of property just aren't all that interested in what you're trying to do. They just want their money. So we had to move very quickly, and we had to have partners who were willing to organize capital around this project, that understood our mission, and that were willing to work with us in developing all of the financial structures necessary to bring this project to fruition. So the slide that you're looking at is really just a snapshot. I wanted to highlight a few things here. On the right side, you can see in the bubbles that we have a number of different focuses, trying to get to what Elise was saying about centering rather than just addressing. We tried to make all of these pieces of our project really at the same level. We wanted to provide long-term control and ownership of the facility, because if you're just a tenant, you can't really control your future. Local sourcing was obviously very important. So we wanted to put it in the middle of the marketplace, in the middle of that local supply chain in East Bay. We wanted to make sure that it was renewably powered and green built to the maximum extent possible. Food Service Partners is committed to living wages. They are unionized and they pay full benefits, including healthcare benefits for families, and they're committed to local hiring. That's really important to this project. You also heard mention of creating pathways to employee and stakeholder ownership. And I will explain a little bit about how we did that in our financial structure, but that was also very critical to the success of this project. It also needed to be cash flow positive from day one. I know everybody likes to kind of push the economics to the side a little bit, but the economics are actually critical. You have to do good and you have to make money, because you have to be able to pay back the financing. And if you can show that you can do that from day one, it makes the structuring a lot easier and a lot more approachable. It was also really important for us to try to leverage what I call low-cost financing. Sometimes that didn't fit perfectly with this type of project, and I'm going to explain to you a little bit about our partners and how they all came together to put together what I think is a very nice financing package for a project like this, leveraging some low-cost product, but also bringing some market rate product to the table as well. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that our investors were aligned. They had to be aligned with our mission. They had to understand the operation of the facility. They had to understand Food Service Partners as a company. They had to understand Kaiser as a partner and ARC as a partner and other stakeholders as partners. It couldn't just be about writing a check. It also had to be about understanding what we're trying to do as a business. The pictures on the left-hand side just tell you a little story about the building and a couple of snapshots. You can see, this is a pretty typical 1980s built industrial park building. It's in the heart of Alameda County, so it's very accessible and transit friendly. We have 270 kilowatts of rooftop solar installed on the building, and that's going to offset a tremendous amount of electrical load, because as you know from your own experiences, refrigeration is very power hungry. And we wanted to address the environmental impact of this highly refrigerated building with a new technology. So we are actually building our refrigeration system using what's called a CO2 transcritical system. And what that means is we're actually using carbon dioxide as our refrigeration gas. We're not using ammonia, we're not using Freon. This is a HFC, CFC free facility. The main refrigeration units are cooled by high pressure carbon dioxide. And what that means is we are able to achieve very efficient refrigeration. We're also able to call our refrigeration system net zero in terms of greenhouse gases, because we're just using carbon dioxide that's pulled from the atmosphere to actually cool our building. So very excited about that. And next slide, please.
Yeah, and Kevin just wanted to share, we've got a little less than 10 minutes to go and wanted to have time for Q&A. So just a
Absolutely.
minute or so, and then we'll get to some questions we've got that came in.
Great. Well, this is just a summary slide that details what I just spoke about in bullet form. And I really just wanted to highlight a couple of things. As you can see on the structured financing solutions, we were able to pull in 2 community development financial institutions, Community Vision Capital and Consulting, RSF Social Finance. They partnered on the loan. We were able to pull in Commercial PACE. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, PACE is an acronym for Project Assess Clean Energy, and it basically means we were able to float a private bond to pay for the energy upgrades for the building. Kaiser Permanente, as Jean referred to in her presentation, provided some credit enhancement to the project that enabled us to get our lower costs. That was very important to our long-term viability. And then we were able to attract 2 impact investors who were very interested in both energy, refrigeration, and food. And so again, that goes back to the alignment feature. They weren't necessarily interested in real estate, but they really wanted to see us succeed in the refrigeration, the energy efficiency, and the sustainable food operations. So at the bottom, you can see all the partners who were involved. You can look them up. Happy to answer any questions you have. As I said, we're opening the project in December. It's been a year and a half of in the making. And the last bit of advice is don't ever try to do a project like this in the middle of a pandemic.
That's great advice, Kevin. Thank you so much for that. And what a wonderful and incredibly expansive project. And thank you so much to each of you for the detail in your overviews. We could have a full hour and a half on any one of these segments of the presentation and still not feel like we're getting there. So I'm going to do my damnedest to put a couple of the questions that have come through in chat. We will I see some questions coming in. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar as well as some notes that we've gathered, including bios and contact info in case folks have other specific questions to follow up with. But I'm going to throw 2 questions out that combine some themes that have happened in the chat box here. And one of those focuses on the networks. Everybody touched on that. Everybody noted how important for this project the connections between institutions, community groups, and folks throughout the general ecosystem in the East Bay is. So given that there's such variability in both where institutions and community groups are in their understanding of each other and these challenges in this work, a lot of you touched on the slowness and the process of developing that network being really important. The Bay Area is this epicenter of food work and has been for so long. So some questions were asked about how this work and this project intersects, or how this approach would intersect in communities that are already doing other initiatives like the Good Food Purchasing Program, or how does this Regional Food System Initiative and the Healthcare Anchor Network engage with faith communities or other groups that have different ends to this conversation. So maybe I'll ask that to you, Elise.
Well, I definitely feel like we kind of have these like parallel movements and conversations that are kind of happening all over the state and perhaps across the nation. So I feel like, you know, Lucia has dreams of having like a good food purchasing menu that, like, you know, like something that's like really concrete. Lucia's giving the hands up, really concrete that like every anchor could like buy into, right? The other thing is, you know, my hope is that also we're able to feed off of one another. At the very least, you know, I'm trying to be very transparent about where my mistakes were to hopefully save some people some time. But I would love to have, like, you know, some sort of toolkit or best practices so other folks can benefit from this work. But I also feel like we just need to stay in conversation. And I know it's so hard when there's a pandemic and everybody needs to, has a full plate on their own. But I really do feel like everyone benefits when we can kind of show proven successes, and particularly because this work is so region and partner specific.
Mhm.
It's like, you want to make the right answer the easy answer, but the right answer by definition is rooted in place. So it's going to be different. Like, you're not going to be able to transport an entire fully formed package to another city or another community, unfortunately. Well, I don't know if it's unfortunate. It just means we get to specialize.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to that, Elise, about just underscoring the importance of, and Elliot, you talked about it as well, relationship building, opportunities for frequent conversation, being as transparent as possible. And, there's learning happening in all sectors of this work. The anchors are really coming to the table and learning so much more about community and the functions of food hubs, and the community folks are coming in and really learning more about how do anchor institutions buy food and what are the challenges to doing that, and pricing. And, so I think the most important thing is that we are all committed to solutions, to finding success in this and finding solutions together. And that trust that you have when you build relationships, when you convene often and keep the conversation going, is just critical for this to go on, particularly in the long term. And as I said, we see ARC as going above and beyond food as sort of more a model of how we act and how we relate to folks.
Yeah, that's great. Start where you are is something I hear in that. I'm gonna force one quick question, and then I've noted in the comments there's a particular interest in the transition to employee ownership. So I want to flag that, and hopefully we'll have a minute to come back to it. In the spirit of working together and getting towards this sort of transactional and financial challenges that face this work, it's important. There's a theme here about acknowledging how we got here and then looking to the future and wanting to do something differently. And at least you noted that, frankly, how we've gotten here is by all being sort of accepting that institutions can rely on food service contracts and products that effectively are harmful to the system that we want to create. At the same time, we're looking to incentivize new behavior and bring in a new roster to this work. So there were a couple of questions about the sourcing challenges here. One particularly about the risk in each of these transactions. How does it work, and what's an ideal balance, and who holds that risk given the history of how we got here and who is and isn't in this market channel? And then second part of that would be, do you work in this project with BIPOC farmers who are seeking and just haven't found an entry to this market? Or is ARC sort of trying to aggregate the demand to then create those sources?
So we are trying to aggregate the demand. I would say it's hard for me to imagine that a small farmer or a farmer who's a person of color would be able to navigate institutional procurement on their own. I struggle with seeing that being viable. But that's part of the reason why we, ARC, decided to work with food hubs, and food hubs that provide technical assistance and wraparound support for these farmers and food entrepreneurs. So that kind of like alleviated us, because we knew that the farmers and the food entrepreneurs were being taken care of by our partners, where we could kind of focus on the actual sourcing, the huge calculus of figuring out the sourcing. So I think that's the answer to your last question. And then your first question, if I can remember it. Oh, just remind me, I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, no, and then I'm noting the time. We're already here. We're going to run a couple minutes over, so if folks have to scoot, I'll just plug and say that we'll be sending, as I said, a recording of the webinar and some notes, so you won't miss anything really. But the question, at least, was about the risk in some of these transactions, and shifting that balance. How do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that was also really one of the reasons why we switched to an approach of having a pilot. So that the idea that no one is stuck in a situation that's not good for them for an extended period of time, like kind of the term of our pilot is only, 3-4 months. And so there's an opportunity at the end of that term, which we you know, we kind of all just kind of like, well, what's a good timing for you? Or what's a good timing for you? Is that we can make changes as we go along, right? So there's that. There's like safety mechanisms to make sure that no one's like stuck in a hard place for a very long time. And then two, the other thing is that right now we're kind of moving off of kind of a modified purchase order, but the hope is for us to really shift into forward contracting, which would allow for our smaller farmers and our smaller food entrepreneurs to actually have the opportunity to shift and realign their business strategy to be able to actually take a larger slice of the pie in terms of as it comes to institutional procurement. Right now, there is some misalignment in terms of what the business strategy is of our East Bay Regional Food System versus what the procurement practices of our anchors.
Fair. Thank you for that. It's a complicated dance. Well, so I'll take the liberty here and refreshing this final question before we all scoot if folks want to hang around and hear. The idea of transitioning this whole shindig to employee ownership is a really bold and must be complicated decision to make. Is there, I don't know if this is for you, Lucia, perhaps, or anybody really. How'd you arrive at that as a goal, and what are the considerations that you've made in setting that forth?
Yeah, Elliot, I would ask Kevin to weigh in on that as well, because it is set up as part of the financing structure of the new center in terms of the ownership of the center. As I said in my presentation, one of our goals as ARC is really to support the building of small food-related businesses around the center too, community ownership being a priority. But Kevin, do you want to mention something about the strategy for community ownership of the center?
Yeah, no, happy to. Great question. And so I'm a finance person at heart, and I have to tell you that this part of this structure was really more art than science. It wasn't really about numbers. And I know that you all have had this experience where, you know, a company or an organization makes a commitment, but there's no teeth behind it. There's no way to enforce it. And we didn't really have the luxury of time to create an actual structure for employee ownership because we didn't even have the building built. We had to, you know, move quickly to acquire it and get the financing and get under construction because Food Service Partners was actually getting kicked out of their current facility. Their lease is up and they couldn't afford to stay there. Thank you, high tech. And so, you know, we just had to move quickly. So what we did is we worked with the operating and the financial partners, and particularly the senior lender, one of the CDFIs, Community Vision Capital and Consulting, to craft a community benefits agreement. And amongst many of the aspects of that agreement is a commitment, a good faith commitment to actually pursue employee and stakeholder ownership opportunities of the center itself. So we actually embedded that into the loan agreement. So it's actually part of the loan agreement. And if we don't comply with those efforts, if we don't actually do what we say we're going to do, which is to try to make this happen, then, you know, the lender could actually enforce it on us because it's part of the loan agreement. That gave it some teeth, but we wanted to take it another step further, which is we really wanted to create a fixed target as opposed to a moving target. As you know, when you're dealing with real estate, the price keeps moving around all the time. So how do, you know, it's one thing to create an entity, employee stock or employee entity or a co-op or something that could actually acquire an interest in the facility. But how do they know what their target is? How do they know how much money they're supposed to raise? How do we do that? So I worked with the investors and the lenders and with FSP to create essentially an option in advance that over the first several years of operating this project, we have a very specific price at which we're going to value the asset. And we agreed to essentially put that price at below market. That will allow a co-op or an employee organization or some other entity that wants to come in and facilitate a transaction on behalf of employees and stakeholders, something that they can actually target. It's a real It's a real number. It's not going to move around. And that really helps now organize both the capital and the effort around that transition. I can't tell you exactly when it's going to happen. I can't tell you exactly what form it's going to happen in. But as soon as the facility opens, I was saying to Lucia the other day, as soon as it opens, I'm going to start working on it with the partners, and we'll bring everybody together to figure it out. But we wanted to create that very defined, very tangible pathway.
All right, thank you. I know we're at time, but it's a testament that everyone's still here listening, that it's such a fascinating topic, and just great to hear your experience. So thank you to Kevin, Lucia, and Elise, and Elliot for helping us to put this together and sharing what you've got. We'll share the recording and notes with everyone, and also there's a brief survey I put in the chat that we'll send just to hear some feedback and also other ideas. We're continuously learning about this, and just love to explore these things with y'all further. But thank you all for coming today, and have a good one.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
so much, everybody.
Yeah. Bye.